Okay, so moving on now to the Anti-Federalists. So remember, we talked about the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson. That initiated the War of Independence, and the war goes on for a few years. Somewhat surprisingly, the colonies defeat Great Britain, which was one of the great, really, world powers, distracted by other things, so it's not totally shocking. But somewhat surprisingly, the colonists win. New country, the United States, and the initial Constitution was the Articles of Confederation, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in some of its shortcomings and just some of its features in the lecture on the Constitution, on the way it was written, on the way it was designed. But the Articles of Confederation really basically do not work very well. And so after a few years, there is a new constitutional convention called, a new constitution is written, and it's sent out to the states to see if they want to ratify it. And there's a big debate over it. And people who are in favor of adopting the new constitution, the constitution that we now have, that was adopted in 1780 and the 1780s, and we've had since, the people who were in favor of adopting that constitution were called the Federalists. The people who were opposed to adopting it or ratifying it were called the Anti-Federalists. And both groups, but especially the Anti-Federalists, were not entirely united or organized. So when we look at the Anti-Federalists now, we're looking at different writers in various states who certainly had some common themes and some common concerns, but were not necessarily perfectly unified in everything, okay? They were opposed to the Constitution in a very simple way to explain it would be they thought it gave the national government too much power, that it took too much power from the states, and that this meant that it would be a great threat to individual liberties, okay? So the Anti-Federalists, basically, they were opposed to the Constitution, and part of the reason that they were so opposed to it was because of what they thought about democracy and what was actually possible and what wasn't for democracy. So the Anti-Federalists basically thought that in order to have a functional democracy, it needed to happen on a relatively small scale. And they thought people had to have a lot of things in common. And so we'll see the Federalists, especially in Federalist 10, Publius will argue for the idea that this large democracy, this national government that's going to span, really to us, it doesn't seem very large, right? 13 original states. 14, I guess, if Maine eventually became a different state. But, you know, this relatively small area compared to the United States now, but it seemed very large at the time, obviously, okay? And Publius will argue that this very large territory and all of the different interests that it will encompass, that that's actually going to be a great strength for popular rule, not necessarily for democracy in the sense that the Anti-Federalists wanted it or thought it was the only real form of democracy or popular rule that would be possible. But Publius will argue that there will be a form of popular government that this large territory and all of these diverse interests will make possible. And so we'll very much be responding to some of these concerns of the Anti-Federalists. The Anti-Federalists, in part, they had a different, again, it's hard to say that they were all identical here, but in part they had a different set of preferences or a different ideal or a different idea about what democracy should be. But again, part of it was just practical. They just didn't think that that would work. And it was somewhat, not quite prevailing conventional wisdom, but they were not the only people at the time to think generally that democracies only worked on a small scale. If you had a larger scale modern nation, you would have to have monarchy. I mean, obviously the Federalists disagreed. But the Anti-Federalists argued for small, limited government based on common interests, a common education and virtue. They really felt that people had to have a lot in common in order to understand each other and to be able to govern each other in that way, and also to make the sacrifices that they thought that Republican government or self-rule required. Okay, so the Anti-Federalists, very simply, if you put it in a very simple meme form, they did not like the idea of a strong national government. They wanted strong state governments, or at least they wanted state governments to have more power than the national government. If you're going to have a simple balance of power between the national government and the state governments, they wanted the balance of power to favor state governments, okay? The Federalists thought for various reasons that the national government would have to take on certain powers and would have to have more power than the state governments, okay? So in very simple terms, if you wanted to just say the Anti-Federalists, who were they? They were people who opposed the Constitution. Why did they oppose it, or what did they want? They thought it gave the national government too much power. They wanted more power for the states. What did they really accomplish in simple terms? Well, they did push for and successfully pushed for the addition of a Bill of Rights. So the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, that is added just largely because of the Anti-Federalists. Okay, they doubted that a Republican government could effectively govern such a large territory. Again, they thought that all of the different interests would make it impossible for people to cooperate. They wouldn't understand each other, and they wouldn't necessarily have a common sense of identity, and therefore they wouldn't necessarily buy into or recognize as legitimate the federal laws that would come from those kind of faraway national capital, made by people that they didn't know, that they had never met. Whereas at the state level, you're more likely to have some idea of who these state representatives are, to maybe know them, to have more direct interaction with them. So they doubted that it would work at that level, okay? They distrusted the idea of a large, centralized, powerful government. They believed that it would attract, that the more powerful the government is, the more it would attract ambitious, power-hungry people. And that once they got in control, they would use the power that the government had to overthrow whatever restrictions or whatever restrictions there were on government power, or whatever protections there were for individual liberties. The Anti-Federalists at the time could be a little bit paranoid, or even kind of a little bit conspiratorial, especially that James Madison. They really seemed to think that he was almost this, James Madison, if you had to say one person wrote the Constitution, or one person was really the mind behind it, you'd probably say James Madison. They were very kind of singled him out in particular, but in general, they were very suspicious of the Federalists. And that's one of the things that the Federalists sometimes, that Publius gets frustrated by in the Federalist Papers, and says, don't just say, how powerful this government will be and how dangerous it will be. Explain the specific defects in the Constitution that you think that there are. Explain the specific reasons that you think that this government will abuse its power, that it can't be trusted to govern responsibly or effectively. Give specific criticisms of the Constitution. Don't just talk about how powerful it will be and try to scare people with the idea of its power. Talk about specific issues. Talk about specific problems with the design or with the institutions or whatever. So that is sort of part of who the Anti-Federalists were. They were very concerned about the national government, the power that it would have. Okay, they also thought that even apart from that, even if you are not quite as worried about the power and the possible ambition and the possible predatory or tyrannical impulses of the people who will have power, who will exercise that power in the federal government, they were worried that the federal government, the national government, would be so removed from the everyday concerns of the average citizen. And it would be so complicated and so difficult for them to understand, again, in part because it's far removed from what they are actually dealing with on a day-to-day basis, that people would just kind of stop paying attention, and that they would just sort of give up. They wouldn't necessarily, the government wouldn't necessarily have to come in and impose a tyrannical form of government, that the individual citizens would just kind of let it happen, that they would just kind of relinquish their democratic responsibilities as citizens and give the power to the federal government, because it all would be so remote and so hard for them to understand, okay? Another concern of the Anti-Federalists. Federalists basically think that people are going to be focused on the things that really matter to them, which are usually going to be about their economic interests, and that the form of representative government that the Constitution would create will draw these particular interests in, and will keep people engaged enough in politics that you will be able to get reasonable, effective policy that will actually more or less help people and more or less give them what they want. With compromise, because there are going to be so many different groups, but the Federalists were more hopeful that people would be committed enough to at least the things that really mattered to them. Not only then would they kind of get basically what they wanted from government and from policy, but there would be enough input that the government in the form of government and politics would pick up enough of these ideas and keep moving, and again, maintain popular rule. You could debate, how it's actually played out or how it is right now. So the major concerns of the Anti-Federalists, they wanted to preserve things like freedom of the press, trial by jury. They didn't think that there were strong enough protections for things like that in the Constitution itself, in the original document. So basically civil liberties. Again, these specific concerns, freedom of the press, some of the protections if you're under arrest, certain forms of freedom of religion, government investigating you. All of these things they wanted to see preserved and singled out and protected by specific language in the Constitution. And again, that became the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments. They were deeply apprehensive about the idea of the federal government having a standing army. Again, there it is in a meme. They thought, legitimate national defense, that's the justification for the government having a standing army. But they thought that that standing army would very soon be used for tyranny, to impose martial law, to impose a kind of tyrannical, undemocratic form of government. The Federalists, that was one of their big differences, is that the Federalists thought that different aspects of the reality of international politics, which included the United States, and especially the major colonial powers, Britain, France, also Spain, that were active in North America and had significant holdings at the time, they really thought that, a stronger national defense and a more unified national defense, which included some kind of permanent military, was necessary just to defend the country. They really didn't think that you could wait until something happened, wait until there was an attack or a likely attack to try to call up an army or to try to call up some sort of national militia. So Anti-Federalists, maybe somewhat naive. There was, of course, the War of 1812 eventually. So some of the concerns of the Federalists may have panned out. Again, you could debate it a little bit, but the Anti-Federalist concern with a standing army, that goes to a deeper and broader difference with the Federalists over just how much they had to worry about, how unified they had to be, and how much they had to worry about about national security and about the international situation in North America. So those are some of the major ideas and concerns of the Anti-Federalists. We will also then look at Brutus, one of the Anti-Federalist writers named Brutus. We will look at him in particular.